ready? Okay. Okay, so if you take your seats, we're going to get started. This will be the last session. We know we have a lot of drop-off after lunch, so if you want to come down and fill in the seats, that's good too. And I have two reminders for you. One is please fill out the green evaluations. And the second is if you're interested in Narcan training, as I mentioned earlier and failed to mention at lunch, we are just going to offer it for free next Wednesday. Becky Lehman's here from the department, the Portage County Health District, and she will be the trainer. And it's like half an hour. So if you're interested, it's 5:30. It's actually 6 o'clock next Wednesday. So you can sign up online, and the URL is in your program. Okay, so Al, we're good, right? Yeah. They're going to present, right? Okay, so here we go. So I had some real issues pulling this last session together, and so we decided to put it together as best practices in journalism and public relations. We're going to hear from Chad Poynter, a professor at the University of Dayton, who's the head of the media ethics division of a big industry group that media ethics educators belong to. And I think you all know Professor Stephanie Dane-Smith. She's going to talk to us about the opioid epidemic seminar and some other things that have come from that. And then Al a little bit later. So the bios are in your programs. I'm not going to waste time on that. But Chad, hit it.
Sure. Hello, and thank you for having me. As I told Jan last night, I'm actually the outgoing head of the Media Ethics Division, and don't make me do that for another year. When Jan approached me about being part of this, and she said, I really need an ethics person here. I need a media ethics person here. And so I really kind of put together some talking points. I'm going to try to kind of keep my opening statement as brief as possible, just so that I don't talk for about 5 hours, because I could also do that. So when you're talking about, I should also say, just kind of as a heads up as we're getting into this, that a lot of my research into coverage of the opioid epidemic actually is looking at the Cincinnati Enquirer's coverage. So myself and a co-author, Aaron Willis at the University of Colorado, who I believe is watching the live stream. So hello, Aaron. We looked at the Enquirer and actually looked at their coverage a year before. So the heroin beat really started kind of as its own separate beat in about 2016. So we looked at a coverage 1 year before, so all of 2015 and then all of 2016, and we're looking at really what did that coverage look like. And I'd gone down to the Enquirer and interviewed Terry as part of that. So we go back at least a bit. But from an ethics standpoint, really the overriding question ethically of any sort of opioids coverage, at least I believe, is it comes down to loyalty. To whom is duty owed? And I would really kind of break that down into 3 components. The first being your readers or your viewers or your clients. The second being to your sources or your subjects. And the third being to yourself, which I think often kind of gets overlooked when we're talking about duty, but is I think very, very important. Especially, I know in the last panel there was a question about self-care, and we'll kind of get into that as the human tool, the human toll that this type of coverage takes. So the first component of that, the first to whom is duty owed, is to your readers. And part of this is that opioids and the opioid epidemic is a community issue. So, I looked at the Enquirer coverage. I live in Dayton, Ohio. if the Cincinnati Enquirer or if my hometown Dayton Daily News, if those papers weren't covering opioids, close shop. It's done. Like, if you're not doing that as in those communities, you're not doing news anymore, frankly. If it is part of a community, it is part of touching nearly everyone in this community. I have a family member who has an opioid addiction. I have colleagues who have family members who have opioid addiction. We had a student at UD who overdosed in a dorm room. This was actually before I got to UD, but it's it's here, right? So part of kind of this loyalty to readers is really telling the stories that actually affect your community. And part of that, I know from talking to Terry, I think this is 2 years ago at this point, but it's, the Enquirer, for example, it's not unique. It's not swimming in money, right? So starting a heroin beat, putting a lot of resources into that, means that they're not covering something else in the community, right? You have to, there are finite resources, and so covering one thing inherently means that you're not covering something else. And for the Enquirer, for the Dayton Daily, this is an issue that we should be covering. Which means that we're willing to forego other coverage in order to do this story or these types of stories that we frankly need to do in our community. It also means covering this in a particular way. So having complexity to the stories, the way that you frame stories, the way that you provide solutions, not just this is a problem, but this is how we might work our way out of this. And I can get into those a bit deeper, as we get going. And I think one of the things from the last session where they're talking about types of language and word choices, it really comes back down to exactness in language. When I was a grad student, one of my professors was a guy named Ernest Perry. And Ernest would always say, he said it enough that students actually would kind of chuckle when he would say it, but words have meaning. And so your word choice needs to be deliberate. It really comes back to this idea of being clear, concise, and correct. Using correct language. It's not politically correct language. It is correct language. It is not, someone is not an addict. Someone has an addiction. It's a way to not define someone by their disease. So kind of first would be readers, right? Second is we really have a duty to our sources or to our subjects. So part of that is thinking about privacy rights and thinking about kind of the difference between a right to know, a need to know, and a want to know, to talk about this in ethical terms, right? There are certain bits of information that we have a right to know. Typically, those are things that our government is doing. Public records, that sort of stuff. We also have a need to know certain information that will allow citizens to go about their daily lives in society. So here, it could be something like, we have a need to know the number of overdoses in a day, right? We have a need to know efforts to, I'm going to keep going back to the Enquirer coverage, but one of the stories that has always stuck in my brain was I think you still do this yearly, the story about government authorities going through the parks before Easter because there's Easter egg hunts and you need to sweep the parks of dirty needles beforehand. Like, we even need to know that kind of stuff. And then we have a want to know, which really doesn't have much, if any, kind of ethical grounding to it, but it speaks to our curiosity, right? It speaks to this idea of kind of acquiring and disseminating information. So we need to think in terms of privacy with sources. We also need to think in terms of minimizing harm. We often, as journalists, we are interacting with people on the worst day of their life. And we need to think in terms of kind of how we tell these stories in a way to minimize harm, right? So one of the things that Aaron Willis and I talk about a lot is what we call addiction porn, right? And I would say, and I've actually had conversations with people in this room about the kind of the famous photograph from East Liverpool, Ohio, where there's a 4-year-old boy in a car with his parents. I think it's actually a grandparent and a parent who had overdosed on heroin. This photo, and in many papers would run this with the child's face blurred out, but not the parents. I would argue that really depends on context, but typically speaking, these photos ran for no good reason other than voyeurism, right? If it's part of a larger story to get into this conversation of what this is doing, to what opioids are doing to our community, you could make an ethical case there. Showing this picture for the sake of it is a good photo, and it is a good photo. It is visually compelling. That is not a good enough reason to publish it or to broadcast it. We also get into, and this was talked about earlier in the day, ideas of victim shaming and trying to avoid victim shaming. And also, this gets into a bit of privacy, gets into a bit of minimizing harm, but there are many questions about ideas of autonomy, especially autonomy of sources who may be either high or may be withdrawing, or sources who maybe have just been arrested, or all sorts of stuff, right? There's also issues when we're talking of sources. There's issues of confidentiality. The opioid possession is a crime. Opioid use is a crime. I think that we are in a right path if we are treating opioids as a medical issue or as an addiction issue as opposed to a crime. But the law of the land is that it is a crime. So getting sources or identifying sources by names can be ethically problematic at times. And there's also, there is a stigma that is attached to addiction. So again, identifying sources by name can be at times ethically problematic. We can get into that a lot further as we go. The other kind of component of loyalty would be loyalty to ourselves, right? Loyalty to ourselves as journalists. There is a human toll that this coverage takes on a reporter. I can say even coming at this from a researcher perspective. So the semester, it was basically one semester that Dr. Willis and I went through 2 years of Cincinnati Enquirer coverage. That was a really bad semester for my students because I was often either emotionally drained by the time I got to class, or I was in a bad mood, because I've read, I can, 2 stories always jump to mind first in this. The first, there was a story about there was a baby that was having a surgery at Cincinnati Children's Hospital. While she was in surgery, her parents went into the bathroom and overdosed, and one of the parents died. I think the one lived. But, baby comes out of surgery and your parent's dead. There was another, and I think there were a series because they followed through the court trial as well, but where a mother sold her child to her drug dealer. These have a very human toll. Obviously, these have a very human toll on the subjects, obviously. But this day in and day out takes a toll on the reporter as well. And there is a bit of self-care that's needed to this. As the Inquirer folks said in the last session, some of these stories involve sources who ultimately die. When I was a journalist, my main beat was music. My sources didn't die, right? I was reasonably assured that that I was going to see them again. And a lot of these stories are just gut-wrenching. They hit you, and they hit you at an emotional level. I think I will stop there. I should point out, this is just a shameless plug for the University of Dayton, but some of our students last semester did a documentary called Epicenter. I think you actually have a bit of it. So it was, Epicenter's really, it's a short documentary. It's available on YouTube. A short documentary about the opioid crisis in Dayton. It was completely student-driven, and they actually won a student Emmy for it.
Thank you, Chad. Next, we're going to hear from Professor Stephanie Dane-Smith. Professor Smith, aside from having the office right next to mine, which is probably the most important thing you should know about her,
ethically challenging,
teaches in our public relations sequence and has a joint appointment in the School of Communications. And she did a most amazing class last spring called the Opioid Epidemic Seminar. I asked her to talk about this because it was just life-changing and inspiring, not just, I think, for her and for her students, but for me next door to hear all the things that students could do and the ways they went about doing it. And this is from mostly a public relations perspective.
Thank you. First, Chad, you were very eloquent, so you win.
The first time in my life.
And it had to be today. I loved what you said. Everything resonated with me. I am fortunate that Jan asked me to be part of this, but really I'm here because of 18 very brave students at Kent State. I brag on Kent State all the time, so I'm going to go ahead and do so today. But the College of Communication and Information last semester held a 15-week course called the Opioid Epidemic, in which we asked students from all of our disciplines, whether it be photography, journalism, communication studies, public relations. We brought them together and we asked them to work on a client-based project. The client, technically, was the Alliance for Substance Abuse Prevention of Trumbull County, Ohio. I live in Trumbull County. I was born in Trumbull County. In Northeast Ohio, I think it's very fair to say Trumbull County is the epicenter of the opioid epidemic. We asked them to work with this organization, which is an offshoot of the Trumbull County Mental Health and Recovery Board, and to really work on a couple of public education campaigns, 4 to be specific. But in the process and in service of this client, the students themselves had to recognize that they were doing advocacy work, and they were doing advocacy for people who were users, misusers, and their families. That no matter who they were technically working for, they were asked to represent users, misusers, and their families. We asked these students not to start off, not deliberately so, but as it turned out, we asked them to do something that was relentlessly hard and to do it day after day after day for 15 weeks. We asked them to deal with their own experiences and their experiences with mom and dad, with addiction. A good portion of the students either had personal experience or their families had experiences. So they had to relive those and then sideline those in service to their real clients. We asked them to be the voice and the advocate for a group of citizens, our brothers and sisters in humanity, who get a frequent amount of media coverage, or we wouldn't be here today, but who are relentlessly unheard. Their voices are often characterized and stereotyped rather than deeply heard. And finally, we asked these students to go where it was gritty and to go there frequently and go there deeper, deeper, deeper. These students spent a fair amount of time in places like homeless shelters. They were out of pocket, hundreds of dollars. Driving between here and Trumbull County is about an hour's drive, and we didn't have a class budget. So they took it upon themselves not only to be the voices for the men, women, children, parents, grandparents, teachers, clergy, neighbors of people who are users and misusers, but to make sure they were checking their humanity. And I'll give you an example of how we began the semester. We began the semester with the story of Kevin, an 11-year-old boy from Trumbull County. Some of you may have covered him in the news, but I kind of doubt it. He was high on the autism spectrum. His parents lived, his mother and his mother's boyfriend lived in a day hotel. He had a younger brother. He was pretty much ostracized at school because he didn't smell good, he didn't look good, and he had a form of autism that made him nervous around large crowds and other kids. So every day he ate lunch in his principal's office, and they played chess together so he wouldn't be all alone in the lunchroom. So we've heard stories of children like this, but Kevin's story has a different twist to it. On December 21st, 2016, he went home from school, and his charge was to watch over his younger sibling. His parents were out, and we might assume that they were using because they want to avoid dope sickness. And Kevin hung himself in that hotel room on the cord of a blind. His parents came home and found him, and there were warrants for their arrest, so that was problematic. Burying him became problematic for him. His school system rose to that challenge. His teachers and the parents, they all rose to that challenge. So my students began knowing the story of Kevin, and they went to Kevin's neighborhood. They saw the hotel where Kevin perished. They began to understand something about Kevin's life and his school system. And it's very easy for any human being, I hope, even in 2018 America, to empathize with Kevin. But by the end of the semester, I feel strongly, because I watched these young men and women, these phenomenal men and women in my class, they really began to empathize and feel the journey of Kevin's parents, which was different and remarkable, and nobody was documenting that part of the journey. So those were the bookend points of the class. Specifically, the class divided into teams, and they were given 4 challenges. One team was asked to educate the public of Trumbull County on opioid risk factors. The county pretty much believes the scenario goes like this. You smoke marijuana, the next day you'll use heroin. Most people know that's not so true, and the fact is that alcohol is much more the gateway in Trumbull County than is marijuana. But they needed to educate on the risk factors. A second team was charged with trying to reduce the terrible stigma of Narcan use that existed within the Trumbull County community. And so that was their target, trying to end the stigma and educate. And even in this classroom today, there have been needs to educate on Narcan, what it is and what it isn't. And I assure you it's not a party. The third team was charged with coming up with an out-of-school curriculum for children ages 9 through 12, because some of the research had showed that school-based curriculum was too sporadic to be useful. And how do we reach children outside of school? And then the fourth team, and you heard from Amelia Sheeran this morning, who is part of that team, was charged with coming up with a campaign to restore hope in Trumbull County, a place that's been decimated for decades with job loss, erosion of industry, erosion of population, and now so desperately hard hit by this addiction. And the teams put together 4 campaigns that naturally, as a proud professor, I will call brilliant, but I think that no one who heard them on presentation day, May 4th, 2018, left that auditorium unmoved by the work of 18 incredible men and women, and you're fortunate to see some of it on the screen. They did work that resonated so well that within a month, the client decided to pick up the client who's funded primarily by donations, and because there have been too few tax levies to really fund the client, has decided that they would go ahead and implement one of the campaigns, the Risk Addiction campaign. And then just this week decided that they were going to begin also implementing the Narcan education campaign. This is a campaign that in Trumbull County is going to reach into every high school and middle school. They're targeting movie theaters, laundromats, places where people go. And my students, and it will shock you that Kent State students did this, they did research on about 20 bars in Trumbull County. It's one of the harder parts of it. But they went there and they just talked about what was going on. And they found that there was a lot of correlation between drinking behaviors and using behaviors, but there was also a lot of misinformation. So they also targeted bars and frequent bar patrons as places where they could educate. They made friends with local business owners who agreed to become hope dealers, and that they would put on their windows decals that said, "Hope dealt here." So they did a lot of exciting multimedia stuff, some films, some public service announcements, photo exhibitions, multifaceted campaigns. The team that did a campaign on educating outside of school decided to use our mall as a venue. And they got the mall owners somehow, against my knowledge, to agree to this. And they had developed a plan to stage an education campaign there, particularly during the holiday season when a lot of young people still flock to the malls. And they created a fictional character named Pax, who was gender neutral and who really wanted to instill in the community and the community's children this notion that we must practice positive each day. This wasn't something the students arrived at because they saw some clever advertisements. Instead, they went to an after-school tutoring group for Black youth and indigent youth in Trumbull County. And they asked them to draw their role model. That's the kind of primary research they did. They simply said, draw your role model. Who does your role model look like? Now, the Cavs were still in it, and we still had LeBron. And they were fully prepared for lots of LeBron. And what they got instead, they got a LeBron for sure, but what they primarily got was my aunt, my cousin, my dad. And when we asked them to define what makes this person a positive role model for you, it wasn't in the case of the Cavs players because they win a lot, because they won and they had a big parade. The students, these youngsters, again and again and again, use the words, they practice. They practice being kind. They practice being good. They practice, practice, practice. That word, talk about a research insight. So we built a whole children's campaign around the notion of practicing positive, whether it was dealing with hope, whether it was telling students, young students, you can make choices. And when something bad happens in your home, and when you feel bad, and when you witness something that we as adults would label trauma, when you witness something like that, tell someone. Someone's there to help you. to educate, truly educate on what Narcan is. Like most of America, when our students surveyed, spending a lot of months out in the snow in front of every giant eagle, I swear, in Trumbull County, what they found was a lot of people who didn't understand Narcan, but also felt that if it had to be administered, it should only be administered 3 times. That after that, that's that. If you have to have Narcan 3 times, well then. So they had to deal with that hopelessness. And I must say one thing about these students. You must understand that some of them understand Narcan from a very personal basis, from mom, from dad, from themselves. And having to deal with that emotion and produce a professional product that the client has decided to implement means the world. At the end of it, someone asked the students, and I think you're seeing, Trumbull County ran a billboard all summer long with the students from the class. And so and our client and our dean, and you're seeing this ragtag army of the world's most fabulous students. And you would be lucky to have them in your workplaces because they have so much heart. When one student was asked, why did this matter to you? Why was it transformative? I think she would feel comfortable with me sharing that she had lost her mother to the disease, that her father was still using. She had three siblings from whom she simply wants to graduate and earn enough money to get the custodial care of those siblings. When you have something that real happening in your classroom, you have something that's magical, something that brings credit to a university, and something that also tells us we are growing a generation of advocates who don't have to be taught not to use the word junkie. After all, we don't call diabetics sugar whores. We don't have to teach them that. They come at it from a place of respect, from a knowledge that these are my brothers and sisters. There are wounded all over this community, but there is the chance to do something good by giving them voice. And I feel very fortunate that Jan Leach, I finally had the chance to tell the story of these 18 students, and I thank you for that.
Al.
All right. So Jan has decided to extend this session until 5:30 so that I could start with Aristotle, then do Socrates, then St. Augustine and John Stuart Mill, and so settle up. All right. So here's what I want to do in the last minutes that we have together, and that is to go through some case studies. You guys, by the way, if you want to relax, I'm going to call on you some, but I don't know if you want to sit in the lights or not, but you can do whatever you want. But I want to go through some case studies, and this is where you play along, right? Are you willing to play along? Yes. That was not the enthusiastic response I was hoping for. Let's try again. You are willing to play along, aren't you? Yes. There we go. All right, so with that in mind, I want to set the stage for what we typically think of in journalism as the guiding principles for ethical decision making. These are principles that were originally written by a colleague of mine at Poynter named Bob Steele, later adopted in a modestly different form by the Society of Professional Journalists. But pay attention to the order in which they appear, because Bob wrote them in this order for a reason, which I will explain to you as we go along. So first, seek truth and tell it as fully as possible. So the first principle of journalism, according to the SPJ Code of Ethics, is to seek truth and tell it. Listen, to seek truth and tell it, not to seek truth and withhold it, but to tell it, which is very much what the Inquirer ended up doing in their project, and we've seen in your work and so on, is to seek truth and tell it. At Poynter, we often talk about green light ethics as opposed to red light ethics. Green light ethics meaning find ways to report, not ways to withhold. That doesn't mean there won't be times when we'll tap the brake and say, wait, maybe we need to think about this, and we'll practice this as we go along. But your overarching principle as a journalist is to tell truths. Second, act independently. Independent of your own biases, independent of your own belief system, independent of all of those things that might drive you, independent of your commercial concerns, independent of your politics, independent of what you might think is good for your paper or for your TV station or your radio station, independent for what is good for you. And that was one of the things I was thinking about as I was thinking about these three pods that Chad described, as he said, readers, sources, and self. And if I were processing those three words, readers, I would start with, yes, readers and non-readers and non-viewers and everyone else. We don't just think about the people we serve, but we think about all the people who might also be affected by what we do, even if they are not your customers. Sources, yes, but also the people who are affected who weren't sources. And self, yes, you should be guided certainly by your own morals and your own beliefs, but guided, not run by those, guided by those. They inform your decisions, but they don't make your decisions. Act as independently as possible. And by the way, I would say that's one of the things that separates journalism from every other kind of communication. Advocacy is what's good for you, what you believe, what aligns with your beliefs. But journalism means that you give fair, equal voice to things with which you might disagree. And I think that's one of the big differences between what you often see in cable news and AM talk and stuff like that, is that it doesn't give full voice to things with which the host or speaker gives their own opinion. Does that make sense to you? Do you cover things with the same veracity that you disagree with personally? If you do, then you might be a journalist. Minimize harm is third, not first. This is one of those things that's so difficult for us as we try to fit our humanity with our journalism. Because your instinct, because you're good people, is to minimize harm first and then find ways to report around the harm. And the problem here is that I would ask you to stipulate that virtually everything we do in journalism causes some kind of harm to somebody. Photographs that they would rather not have published, information they would rather not have made public. We publish and broadcast information that lots of people would rather us not do. But if we started by saying, how can I cause the least possible harm and offend nobody, you wouldn't do much journalism. Not one person in all probability would have ended up in that heroin project that the Cincinnati Enquirer did, except for someone who claims they're doing something fantastic to fix things. So you don't start by minimizing harm. You start by maximizing the truth-telling. And then finally, and this is the tenet that the Society of Professional Journalists added to this, and I think it's a good one, is be accountable, be accessible. May I say, as journalists, not our best thing. You want to be treated badly, call a newsroom and offer them a way that they might improve their reporting and see how well you're being treated. It's not our best thing. I was telling somebody a few weeks ago, I ended up doing a column for Poynter, and it was not that big a deal. I mean, I wasn't being mean to anybody. If I was being mean to anybody, it was to other journalists. And yet, I got almost 1,300 complaint comments and 4 death threats. And I would even tell you that that's not even a record for me. So it's one of those things that you got to say, okay, what am I going to do now? And I ended up responding to over 500 of the comments. I stayed up almost all night responding to them because I thought, you know what, if you still believe that it's worth commenting, then you deserve an answer. And so I answered them. And I actually had conversations with some people. And some of them were really interesting. One of them hoped that I die of slow prostate cancer, which I thought that was at least creative. But it's one of those things that you deserve an answer if you bothered to comment, in my judgment, even if it's a snarky comment. If you ask a question, I think you deserve an answer from me. Now, I'm not going to keep doing it for 4 days. I got stuff to do, but if you're going to write something provocative, it seems to me you ought to be accessible to people to respond. So let's put into effect these 4 principles. Seek truth as fully as possible, act independently, minimize harm, and be accountable, be accessible. We're going to put these into practice now. They're not going to be just theory. We're actually going to apply them. And we're going to apply them to that very now famous case that you all know. Can I stipulate that you all know this story reasonably well? Let me give you a few facts just to be sure that we are going to be able to walk through this. So a police officer noticed this van driving in the morning as people were driving to school. The van was driving erratically. Police officer pulls behind the van. And about the time the police officer pulls behind the van, the driver ends up, for all practical purposes, passing out, overdoses. And so does the adult female passenger. That is the child's grandmother. The 4-year-old child in the back seat is sitting there fully alert. The police officer gets out of his vehicle, calls for emergency backup. And while they're waiting for transport, the police officer pulls out his phone and snaps a few photographs. He says a few, I only know of 2, but in any case, there's more than one photograph, right? So these 2 photographs are these, and what happens next is where this case gets truly unique and interesting. A handful of journalists heard about this and actually made a request for the information. By various accounts, between 3 and 4 reporters, somewhere either 3 or 4 different accounts, wanted the actual incident report and anything else that could go with it. The police responded to that request, which was essentially an open records request, by not just releasing the information in the photographs, but instead by posting that information and the incident report, which I have if you're interested, on Facebook, along with a short statement from the police chief saying, we're releasing this information because this is what's going on in our town. It's important that you know we see this kind of thing all the time, and it's a big deal. And so they released the images and they released the incident report all right there on Facebook. So now the whole world's got it. And it's a sensation. I mean, it's a sensation. So here's my question. Considering for the moment, although in the Twitter sphere you may think of this wherever you are, not maybe even in Ohio, which could give us a different set of answers. But let's consider for a moment that we are all Ohio journalists. My question to you would be, here you are in your Ohio newsroom. These images are on Facebook. It's clearly legal for you to use these images in that they are in the public record and now they're in the public venue, posted there by the police department. So there's no question you have a legal ability to use these. The question is what do you want to do with these images in your news coverage? That's a real question. Remember, you promised you were going to play along. So where do you want to start with this? I will wait you out. And remember, this is what stands between you and cocktail hour. So just shout it out. Somebody, who's talking? Yes, yes, he's always game for something back there. Good for you. All right, what do you want to do here?
I want to ask you the same question with a negative sign. Like why do you, why do you think that I shouldn't publish this photograph?
I'm not telling you what to do. I'm just asking a question. I'm doing what ethicists do. I'm asking a question.
I would publish this for greater.
You would publish it.
Yes.
And why would you do such a thing?
For the greater good of like community.
You have some notion that this is going to be greater good?
If-
You know what's wrong with you journalists is you're just trying to get clicks and stuff, aren't you?
No.
That's all you're trying to do is you're trying to stir people up to show this little boy, and you're just trying to get clicks.
I think you were judgmental.
What?
I think you were judging me now. Judgmental? You were judgmental.
Of course I'm judging you.
Yes, it cannot.
Was there ever any doubt that I was judging you? Of course I'm judging you.
Like these occasion only happens in people's life one time. You don't die before you die.
Oh, but it doesn't just happen one time. They said that this happens all the time.
No, not in their life.
Yes, it happens all the time there. In East Liverpool. Absolutely. They said this is a very common thing. They're sick of it. They're angry that they have to keep doing this. So our cold-hearted, child-hating man in the back says that he wants to run this photograph. Who else has an idea here? Yes.
I have a comment. If I were looking at this as an editor, and this goes back to, I guess, the legalities, I would question.
Let me stipulate the legalities. It's in the public record. You have legal ability to run this. It's in the public record. They have posted it as a public document.
So even though, say, the police department might, get into trouble for this because it shouldn't have gone beyond the prosecutor's office or the.
That's just, we ought to ask a series of questions before we jump to that. Did they have a legal responsibility to release this? The police department says clearly yes, that it's part of an incident report. The photographs are part of evidence. They've already presented this in a first hearing. There's no doubt this is part of the public record. Does that answer your question? Yeah, so there's no doubt this is in the public record, but just because we can doesn't mean we should. You heard our Pulitzer Prize winning journalists say earlier that sometimes people would even ask them, don't take my picture, and you heard her say, sometimes I wouldn't. I could. If it was on a public street and the person was in the public street, there's no doubt that I could.
Al? Oh, thank you. So are you ready? All right, first of all.
Oh God, here it comes. Not only does she have something to say, it starts with first of all. It's going to be a list.
I do want to weigh in on, very quickly on the topic, the term, what'd you call it, addiction porn? I object to that. I think it's an easy criticism of us trying to do our job and covering this tragedy that's unfolding. So I would want to know, to me, this is fair game. The grandmother in me and the mother in me, I really struggle with showing the child's face, but if you show the grandmother's face, the child will always be identifiable anyway.
Maybe, but we would have to ask, Connie, whether or not they share a name, like a last name. We don't know
Fair
that.
enough, we could do
But
that.
even if they do, if we don't name the child, then we might have a different concern. Some of us of a certain age remember a time when a newspaper reporting would basically stay in that community, but now anything online is going to be searchable and available for virtual ever, right?
Forever.
So this child's name was not reported in most.
Right.
I can't prove most, but I've looked at this so many times, so many ways, that I've seldom see the child's name.
And some news organizations did blur the face, but the thing is, the look of innocence on that face is part of the composition here of this photograph.
What do you mean?
And because you see a child who really has no idea what's going on, who is clearly vulnerable. I can't tell.
Could be this child has seen this so often they don't even.
The child is 4. No matter how many times, the child is 4 years old.
Yes.
But part of the story is the police. Why did you share it? You said this is happening every day. What is the data behind that?
In just a moment, you're going to hear from the police in a way that I suspect you've never heard from them before.
All right, well, I'm saying these are the considerations that I would say if I were an editor to my reporter, all right, yeah, we're going to run this, but we've got to tell the fuller story because the police are justifying this as saying it's the other way.
Listen to what Connie is saying. Tell me, I'm dangerously close to mansplaining here, so stop me if I get there.
You know I shall.
But what I think I heard you say is that the cost of entry to running the photograph is not to use the photograph as decoration or clickbait or any other word. The cost to using this photograph is to take a deeper contextual dive into the story. If you're only going to use the photograph for decoration, that's not enough. Yes?
Agreed.
And that's an interesting one because that's not a yes or a no. And ethical decision making requires us not to get stuck on yes or no, but how can we? How can we make a green light decision to use this image? And what I heard Connie say is one way of doing that is to put enough resources and time and effort into this so that that image is more than a decoration, which obviously is what our colleagues in Cincinnati did, right? They said, look, we're going to tell a lot of uncomfortable stories here, and we're also going to make enough of an effort that we put those stories into a deep context so that you can see how it all fits. It's not a one-time punchline. It's a trend.
May I add one more observation and
Please.
hand over the mic? I have a public Facebook page, and I have about 180,000 followers. That's not a brag. I'm just trying to explain the context here. And when I posted, I think I posted a story about this that had the photos. What really struck me, this will not surprise you, Stephanie, is how many people were stunned. How many? Probably both.
Yeah.
Stunned. Had no idea. And many people knew people in East Liverpool.
What stunned them?
That, well, I think they weren't willing to say precisely what was stunning, but for many of them it was, wait a minute, grandparents, white people in a van?
Yeah.
I mean, it was all that stuff, but they just didn't realize it was this bad.
Yeah.
So there's that value that you can only know after publication, right?
Okay.
I know it now, but I wasn't sure at the time. Thank you.
I think that we ran the photo before.
I'm going to report. You think that you ran the photo but blurred?
Yeah, blurred the child, and that would have been my concern.
That would have been your concern was the child. Get this person a microphone here. She's saying something important for us here that we want to. Okay, thank you. Yeah.
I'm almost sure that you didn't. We didn't run it. And I only say that because I remember when I initially interviewed Terry, she specifically talked about this photo and how much she hated it.
Hated it.
And that and I believe that you did not run it.
We didn't run it, okay.
I believe.
Why wouldn't you run it, Liz?
I wouldn't run it primarily because of the child.
Okay, so we
If they have, because then.
I hope not to alarm you, but he's arguing to run. You're arguing to withhold, and you're arguing conditionally run, but only if you put enough muscle behind it to make it worthwhile. Do I have that right? So we have a range of ideas here. Context.
It has to have context. You can't just put it out.
Even with context, you're still uncomfortable.
Yes.
Yes. So there are other questions about this photograph that I think, yes, go ahead.
Sorry. So in my ethics class, one of the philosophers that we discussed was Kant, which he's not the most popular with journalists because his main thing is to not use people as a means to an end. And I think that implies in this case greatly because not only do we have to think about the greater good, but we also have to think about the victims who are in this photo, not just the child, but the addicts themselves. So I think that we could probably find a middle ground here, maybe running the photo so that the truth can be told. But I do like the idea of blurring the faces so that the identities of the people can be respected.
I see. So how does that fit with the whole idea of shaming? If we're not shaming people, then why should we be blurring their faces? Doesn't that fit with the notion that we shouldn't show these people because that's a shame that they would do that? That got Betty going. All right, go ahead. Microphone's coming to you, Betty.
So I'm going to disagree with that because...
With what?
With what she said.
Oh,
because,
the blurring thing.
yes, because if this is something that's happening every single day, I don't see the purpose of... I mean, I get it, but if it's happening every day, obviously this is an issue. And just simply trying to blur the faces, like it's not one of those things we have to like come to like a middle agreement. I think in this case, it's just one of those. It's like we have to report what's
And
there.
Brandon.
Yes.
By not showing those pictures, are we making any difference? Are we fixing the problem by not showing them? How's that doing for us?
If we don't show the pictures, we're highlighting a problem. But I think in this case, we need to put a face.
And Connie said that a lot of people had no idea this was going on because we don't show it.
Well, that's why we need to show it.
Ha! What do you think of that?
I don't have the answer. I'm gonna throw out some more questions. I have a stomachache just listening to all of this. So, I guess two points I want to make. Obviously, everybody knows about these photos. If there was no child in this photo, would they be important?
Let me answer that. No. We wouldn't have any conversation about this. They would just be two more people sitting in a car overdosed. And when you call the editor, he's going to go, "Where's the news in that?" I could do that story every day.
So the second question is to the photojournalists. If you're blurring the photo, isn't that an ethical question because we don't Photoshop photos?
Well,
Right? I don't know the answer.
It's situational. Ethics is always situational. But what I would say to you is that if you disclose your method and you say it's been altered and this is why we altered it, it might be more ethically acceptable. So disclosing method doesn't erase sin, but it does mitigate it. So if you change something, if, for example, you brighten an image way beyond, but you disclose, we brightened it so you could see the detail, you might have a reason for doing that. I saw a couple of hands go up, and then I'm going to press forward here to keep this story moving because there's a lot more to talk about it.
I have a 3-year-old boy. So this
3-year-old.
3-year-old son. So this is actually, it's heartbreaking to look at. However, I think it was during the very first session, the young KSU student who wrote the playwright said, we need to be comfortable talking about what makes you uncomfortable. Because if not, we're never going to figure out a solution or move forward with this.
Right.
So it brings a light, as much as it's disturbing and sickens me, it brings a light and educates people and lets them know that this is a reality. It's not something that just happens to junkies or people that are sick. It's a bigger impact than just the people who are addicted or have the addiction
Yeah, we protect
issues.
people all the time who are crime victims,
It impacts their
particularly
son.
rape victims. There are all kinds of people that we grant anonymity to.
It impacts more than just them. It's impacting their son, and it's very obvious in this picture that it's beyond them at this point.
Back in the back. I don't know where the hand was. I just saw one back there. Gentlemen, yeah.
Yeah, I just wanted to bring it back to when you were saying that this is something that happens all the time in this community, right? So I think that this picture is important to run because if this powerful image, which it did, makes its rounds all over the internet, and it's powerful and it kind of impacts people oh, there is something really wrong happening because there is a kid in the back of this car. That's the biggest thing is these two grandparents were very irresponsible in not taking care of this kid. So if that image is powerful enough, it gets the attention of the people that need it to get the attention for, like our congressman and governor and all of that situation. They know that this is happening, but when you see something like this, or you see something like the little boy who was washed up dead on that beach from Syria, those are things that are oh, we know it's happening.
Yeah.
And then you see it, and you're like,
They forced the
that's
conversation,
crazy.
you mean. Go ahead, Heather. I'll repeat.
Okay. So I think my big question is always, does it add to the context?
Does it add to the context?
Because if this is a police blotter story, that's a very different thing
Right.
than, two people overdosed in a car and there was a kid in there. To me, then looking at journalism as a greater societal good, and we're going to take that first principle of telling the truth as fully as possible.
Right.
This is the truth.
It's
that
an
we have in
echo
our
of
community.
Connie here.
Right.
That it's not just a police blotter story.
It's not just a police blotter story. Can we put the muscle behind it? Can we cut through the fatigue that they might have in this community by putting that picture out there and telling a full story?
You're making Bruce's heart hurt. He doesn't have enough staff to be able to do this. He'd love to be able to do this, but he just can't. Get the story out there, then we'll keep following up on it. But let's report the story. That's what Bruce said. Yeah, he's a moneymonger. He really wants his money. Yeah. Bruce, what are we going to do here? How do we think through this?
Well, how we thought through it before we published the photo was the discussion that you just had here. And at the end of the day, you're making a decision, whether it's to publish or not, you're still making a decision there. And we went with the second photo, but we also had context.
The photo on the right.
The photo on the right. But we also had context around it because it was part of a larger story we were trying to tell about opiates in our community. I believe this was in 2016, if I got that right. And that was when we had a spike in Akron and Summit County in July. And this, I believe, was in July or August. And so it was part of a larger context, but also to tell the story of this is what happens in Ohio.
So there are some controversies around this image, the one on the right. One of the controversies around the image, besides the photo of the little boy, is this arm right here. That's a police officer's arm. And there's one version of what that arm does, that the arm was taking the pulse of the person. But critics of this image and of the police generally say that that arm was doing what?
Moving the hair.
Pulling her hair to make her head set up so that you could get a better picture of her. Is it possible to take the lights all the way down on this? Would that be possible? Yeah, that'll. Oh, I'm sorry, video people. Gosh, I'm sorry. Maybe you can just shoot the screen or something. I'm sorry. That's good, right there. Perfect. All right, great. That's perfect. Yeah, that'll get us there and keep them happy enough. So this arm right here appears, because her head was like this, right? But in this picture, her head is up. And so the question is that person pulling her head up so you can see her face? Putting her on display like a hunter with a deer? And if so, what do we need to know about the police motives? What did you hear our police officer say earlier today? We need more money, we need more resources, we need more. You know what? I bet this picture could help us. Is that what's going on here? Is that why they released? Because they're sick of begging for money and resources. It's important that the public know we're out here doing this for them. Is that part of what's going on here? We have to ask our questions before we try to get to an answer. What do we know? What do we need to know? How do we actually know what we know? And is there any other way to look at this?
I think there is another way. I hate to interrupt the brilliant mansplaining, but we have all feasted today on victim photos, and they're very gut-wrenching. But so that we understand, we're telling one aspect of the story, and we're personalizing deeply one aspect of the story. I'm not a journalist, so the journalist can descend upon me, and I think I could take you on. Why don't we personalize the pharmaceutical chieftains, not by company names, not by saying we're covering the lawsuits, the class action suits of Purdue. There's personalization there too, because one point, Connie, strikes me, one point, Al, strikes me, and that is the notion that in many people's minds throughout at least Northeast Ohio, the dealer looks dirty and looks like a street person, or is quite often a person of dark color, a bad hombre. And the fact of the matter is that the dealer in America looks like lots of us with the suit and is pulling down a huge income. So while we personalize and we probe the photo composition, all worthy things that we should do, there's another whole personal aspect to this crisis, this epidemic, that gets covered under corporate title and doesn't really get covered under. When are we going to delve into the people who massively profit from this?
How does that play into our decision making on this photo?
I think it plays on the part of the story you choose that gets covered more, right?
This photo is in social media today. It's circulating. We have to make a decision about whether or how we're going to use this photo.
But as you said, very often you have to be careful to be independent And that includes being independent of police reporting that says there is a balance here to be struck, that these people didn't get here on their own, that the story of their lives and how they got in this car, and by the way, I happen to think their images are as important, their face or the blocking of their face is as important as the blocking of that child. I think that at some point, whether it's today or whether it is then in the follow-on coverage, that it gets just as personal and just as direct as the people who continue to profit, because I think that's valid too.
So part of what I think I'm hearing in what you're saying is that the decisions that we make today, we may have to make other decisions on other days as we follow up. We may decide to use the images unredacted today, but in subsequent use, we may do something different or the opposite.
I would just like to see a fuller account of the story that also looks at as personally as at the profiteers as you do the victims. That's all.
Okay. I don't know that I'm going to be able to satisfy that exactly, but I'm going to come closer by showing you something. By the way, if you care, this is the actual affidavit that was made available by the public with, as you can see, all the names of the people who were involved. Now, like a number of you, Time magazine earlier this year did an entire issue around the opioid story. And they did an entire issue with no ads in the issue. It's just cover to cover. And one of the reasons that they started this story is because a managing editor who I ended up interviewing for a Poynter story actually saw this photograph and, like many of you, was touched by it and said, I just need to know more. So they put together a story. The story starts with some of the same concerns that you've expressed here, and that is, why is this boy so newsworthy? Let me offer you one way that I think about this, and that is that very often children, the most vulnerable, end up becoming iconic in our understanding of larger issues. We can think of many such examples. Some of you have already referenced the so-called Aleppo boy who was in the back of an ambulance put there by the white helmets, who the parents of this boy, by the way, said were using him for publicity purposes. The parents appeared on Syrian state TV. That's important that you understand that, saying that that they supported the Syrian government and that they did not support their use of the use of this child as an anti-war statement, and so on. They were never allowed to do, never made available, they never made themselves available, any iteration of that, to anyone that wasn't an Assad-run media source. So we don't actually know whether or not they would have said something to somebody else because we never had that chance. But they also said that the child was not severely injured, that the photograph, they said, the parents said, made him appear to be more injured than he was. Now again, I say to you again that the parents said this on Syrian television, and they were not given access, other journalists given access to them. But this image clearly drew us to a conflict that until that time had not gotten this kind of attention. But this child, this image, this disturbing image, became the iconic image of the moment that captivated us and made us pay attention to a story that we ordinarily might not have done. And so it was with so many images, right? You could probably name them off. The story of Kim Bui. You know her as the Napalm Girl. Kim Bui is a young Vietnamese girl who was hit by American-dropped napalm and was nearly burned to death. She obviously survived and ended up being used as a propaganda tool by the communist regime, the North North Vietnamese, and then also Russia. Russians actually moved her to Cuba to live, and that's where she met her husband. The rest of that story is an interesting one. She met her husband, who's also Vietnamese, in Cuba. They fell in love and got married. For their honeymoon, the Russians allowed them to go to Moscow for a honeymoon. They flew to Moscow, and then on the way back, stopped at Gander, Newfoundland to get a refueling. And while they were going to the bathroom in Gander, Newfoundland, escaped into Canada, got refuge, and she lives in Toronto today. I know this story because I met her at the Toronto airport while we were iced in, waiting for a storm. So it's quite the story, but it's a true story. So very often children make us deal with stories that we might otherwise not pay attention to. With that in mind, I want to play this version of the Time magazine story that goes behind the scenes and talks to the players most closely associated with this photograph of this boy in this van, and why the police did what they did. Can we do one light down on this one as well? Here we go.
Again, this day, I was actually on my way into work. I ended up behind this vehicle. I noticed that it was driving what I termed as erratic. After I made contact with the driver and he actually went unconscious, I wanted to render first aid and call for assistance.
When I showed up, that's when I observed both of them passed out and near dead.
It was during school time. I saw a lot of people there with their kids. There's a bus stop right there where all this was happening. And the first thing I saw coming from my angle is I said, there's a kid in the backseat. I went around the back end of it, opened the door up. He was really shy, really scared, and I don't blame him.
I could just see the pain and the trauma in his eyes. I decided to take several photographs to document the incident for courtroom evidence.
I just unfastened the boy from his car seat, and he eventually turned and looked at me and then just like climbed up on me. And he's wrapped around here on my side, sitting on my gun belt, and I could just feel this little kid's heart pounding, you know, right up on my rib cage here. I was calling for children's services, and our dispatcher called back saying they need some information. And I was pretty heated, I'm not gonna lie. I yelled back over the radio, you know, just tell them to get their butts here now. Fred says, well, let's send them a picture of this, and then they'll see why they need to get their butts here.
I was born and raised here in East Liverpool. It's a great place to grow up. You know, you learn a lot about hard work. Unfortunately, since that time, things have really deteriorated. 75% of our population receives some form of assistance from the federal government. And that's really the tragedy that we're dealing with here.
Right now, opioids are definitely our biggest problem because the people are dying from it.
What we were seeing lately.
It's not just heroin, it's the fentanyl, the carfentanil. That's where they're overdosing because they're so strong.
We got an epidemic, and not only us.
People done passed out on her.
Small town America does.
Oh, he ain't getting up, man.
It's across the country. It's every small department. We're fighting and fighting and fighting this. It's frustrating. We're losing the battle. We are. We're losing. We're trying. We're going to keep fighting, but we're losing. This is something that's been stirring for the past 5, 6 years. And I think it's culminated into one big incident now.
After the driver had pled guilty, the police chief showed me the photograph. And I just stood there silently. I couldn't believe that someone would put that little boy in that position. Sadly, it happens a lot. But this is the first time where it was actually captured in a photograph.
We were all in agreement that it should be seen.
We talked about how we could alter the child's face. You couldn't get the story. And unfortunately, as a public official, it's a felony for me to blur that photo.
There's no number of words that can paint that type of picture.
Coming into work the next day, I could not believe the views that the picture had, you know, and how many times it was shared. We kind of looked at each other like, well, good. Good, let's get this out there.
Releasing that picture made things happen immediately that would have probably not even happened at all, or at the very best would have taken years. It definitely got him out of there, and that was the most important part.
That picture started getting agencies and policymakers and law enforcement talking about the epidemic that's going on, and it drew attention to more resources, access for people needing treatment. We're opening a new clinic in East Liverpool in conjunction with the outpatient services we already have due to the need in the community.
Look what's happening in our little community of 13,000 people. We live in a day and age, unfortunately, where people think there are no lines, that anything should be out there, it's fair game in these type of circumstances. And here we're dealing with a 4-year-old little boy who can't necessarily make those type of decisions as to whether or not he wanted to be in that photograph. The family has been trying diligently, though, to protect him. 20 years from now, is it going to be that this is the image of the heroin epidemic?
As a clinician, I feel that it's my job to be able to advocate for people that are struggling with addiction. I think that posting photos of addicts does probably have them feel pretty shameful and embarrassed. These pictures might keep somebody from reaching out for help because they feel nobody cares about me. They should have just let me die and not used that Narcan.
We know what we did, and we're all confident in what we did was right. So if it upsets you, I'm sorry, but this is reality.
I would do it again. If the same situation arises tonight, that will be posted. I never would have dreamed that this picture would have had the power that it has, that you're sitting here interviewing me. I get people from the state calling me to help. They never called me before. And that's all from the power of one picture.
Now that you've seen that and you've heard from the people most closely associated, how does that make you see the story differently, your decision-making differently? At all? Go ahead.
I think for me, it almost more reaffirmed that I would publish if I were in the position.
Why did it reaffirm?
Because the police officer, I can't remember his name, but it was the black police officer. He said something along the lines of, "If it upset you, I'm sorry." But then I was waiting for him to say that was the point, to upset people, to get them talking about it, to get
He ended up saying what?
I can't remember exactly.
That's what's going on here.
That's what's going on, something along those lines, yeah. But I was waiting for him to say something along the lines of, "It upset you, I'm sorry, but that was the point." That's why this is so important. That's why we talk about it now, because it upset people. That's why it's now in the national stage, and that's what we as journalists do, is try to bring the news to as many people as we possibly can, and bring that perspective to as many people as we possibly can.
Yeah, go ahead.
So I think one of the things we can do is have a conversation with the police officer to see why they think it's important, but I also think we have to be really careful when we publish things that we're not acting out of the wishes of the police and doing things that might trumpet their message rather than finding the message that's most important within the communities that we cover.
We have to be responsible for our own motives for publishing. And my guess is that we should also disclose what those motives are, right? If we publish, we might actually say, normally we wouldn't show a photograph of a child like this. Normally we would protect children. In this case, it's important for you to see. Oh no, when you're going to part with societal norms, you better have a good reason for doing it, and you better be able to explain what those reasons are.
And I think Jan knew I could not talk about this, Bruce too, but no, but I think it's this particular case is a really good example of how we shouldn't just be parachuting into important stories, because you can't just do a one-off on something like this, and that's been touched on in this room. But it also reminds me of a story I was just at a workshop, and we were talking about it, and it was a Chicago Tribune story about PTSD in the black community in some of the really violent neighborhoods in South Side Chicago. And if you look at the Tribune's coverage, it really is not comprehensive. They are not comprehensively covering the violence in their own communities, and that's been a consistent criticism of some of the larger papers in Chicago. So I think it's really, really important when we have incidents like this to take a step back from when we're in that moment looking at that picture, trying to make good decisions about it, to look at the deeper storytelling that we should be doing in our communities and what are the bigger topics and dig in a little bit. And that's hard in newsrooms when you don't have a lot of people now, but it's really, really important.
I'd like to hear from a couple of students, and then I'd love to get your reactions to what you just saw in that video. Can we hear from a couple of students? How did that video affect your thinking about how to make this decision of what to do with the photographs? Making the offer, 3. Yes, thank you, go ahead.
Your one up top too.
Okay, which number was first? Okay, that's fine. I was gonna say. I think, like Austin said, it probably reaffirmed my decision because I also agree with Sue. This is something that we will have to I'll like to sit down with the police and have a talk about because I'd rather not do it just to get a certain message across just based off of, I don't want to say anger, just based off of just emotions alone, but it's something if it's really going to have an impact on people. Because, obviously, again, this is a growing issue, and if it's happening one of those, it's every single day they have to respond to a call where someone overdosed or someone dies of overdosing, it's just one of those, yes, this is a problem, but I think the way that I'll approach it a little bit differently is just not just saying that there's a problem, and just maybe seeing that what either police are recommending to help solve the problem or what other community members are helping to solve the problem. That's just kind of how I will look at it.
How are you all processing the story you just saw?
You had one up top.
Yeah, go ahead, and I'll go up to them in just a second. Hey, go ahead, let me hear from you. I'll come right to you. Hang on.
So the time story, I think it gets back to what you were talking about. We don't need to, just because the police want this photo out does not mean that we have to run this photo.
Now, let's remember, it wasn't that they wanted it out, they were required.
Sure. It still does not mean that we are required.
That's true.
And I think it's interesting when you put up Bob Steele's work, which is of course the basis for the SPJ Code of Ethics. The Code of Ethics flipped a couple of those. So minimizing harm is second in theirs, and how we would talk about this ethically is that these clash. In this story, you cannot run the photo, which is a truth-telling device, without maximizing harm, frankly.
Maximizing harm.
To the child who is not morally autonomous, to the 2 adults in that room who cannot give any sort of consent, who have to go back into that community. I'm not even necessarily saying don't run it, although I would be very squeamish to run it.
Is it possible that we have done this child a service by pulling the public's attention to an epidemic, an illness, that this child otherwise would have lived through, because the resources that followed this, the attention that followed this, ultimately protects that child? The amount of heat, according to the police and other follow-up coverage, the amount of heat that came after this is what forced that child to be cared for in very careful, detailed ways that aren't typical.
You can make the argument.
Would you?
To an extent. Obviously, we don't know what would have happened without the photo and without the photo running.
Let me give you an analogy. When Michael Durant, you remember the movie Black Hawk Down? When Michael Durant was taken captive in Somalia, the Army kept asking us, keep his image on TV, it will keep him alive. I kept thinking, wow, I don't ever remember anybody saying that. Keep his image on TV, it'll keep him alive. And we had many debates about whether or not we should be doing that, because but that was what they said.
Sure.
In a similar kind of way, telling this child's story increases the chances that this child's going to get the care that every child should have.
Although the child is in the custody of the state at a point, right? So what happens to him at that point really is determined by kind of the mechanisms of the state. Ultimately, to run this story, you have to run this photo with the story, you have to run, and I think, Connie, I think you're totally correct here. You have to run with context.
That's the cost of entry.
That's the cost of entry. I would say to be a completely socially responsible newsroom, run an editorial. Tell your readers, this gets back to transparency and accountability.
Explain yourself.
Yeah, explain why you ran this. And explain, I know Bruce and I were talking last night, and he said, on these types of decisions, I want to hear from everyone in the newsroom. I remember in my days in the newsroom, we would have, one of the things that my editor said time and again, I want our readers to know the disagreements that we have in our newsroom. I want our readers to know when we're not all necessarily on the same page.
Bruce, if this child had been non-white.
Never.
Who thanked me? Oh. If this child had been non-white, do you think there'd been as much debate over this?
Never. Zero.
Zero?
Zero.
You're not endorsing this, we're just observing this. Bruce?
I'm not so sure because given the photo, I think you have debate over the photo. Oh. Yeah, I think you'd be talking about the photo itself. If you're saying if it were a black family instead of a white family.
This is the critique I've heard over and over again is, why don't we worry so much when we're showing non-white children in crisis?
And I would say...
That presumes that we don't, but...
Yeah, that's a presumption that I'm not sure is correct. That's what I'm saying.
Okay.
Not in all newsrooms. That's what I'm saying.
Right. Connie, and then I'm going to come back to Stephanie, who's not buying any of this.
Oh, I was just going to say, I've been covering race and race relations in America for 3 decades. And I'm not at all indicting your newsroom. I'm talking about the newsroom I was in much of that time, where one of the top editors referred to black members of our community as mopes. And this is at the height of my getting ready to work for us to run the Michael Green series. I mean, there was such a when I first started there, because I was a single mom who wanted to be there at 9 a.m. instead of 10. I got to cover a lot of the shootings over the evening. I got into so many arguments about I understand running the picture of the mother. Why do we have all these little kids in the picture too? Can't we do a different framing of this photo? Can't we? I just feel like so often we have treated people of color as this absolutely discardable in terms of what we care about in coverage. I'm so glad you brought it up. And again, I am not at all indicting the Beacon. I just remember from my own experience how frustrating this has been at times.
In many ways, you're like our viewers and readers and listeners in that you don't sort of have the journalism collar that you're wearing. How are you seeing this now that you've seen this video?
The video didn't change my mind. I mean, I appreciate having that context, and I think I knew a good deal of that context. It didn't change my mind, and I could support all of these decisions. What I am gratified is as Bruce points out, the discussion that takes place in the newsroom, that it is discussed. It's not an automatic reflex. They just uploaded this picture, it's amazing. Because by repeating it, even though you didn't take the picture, you are framing the story. There is a responsibility, and everybody's acknowledged it here. And that for me is very gratifying to hear. But I just feel that that you also know there's victim shaming that goes on. You're not responsible for it, but are you also feeding and framing? And isn't the purpose of what you're doing to tell the whole story? And in East Liverpool, the whole story is a local story. I get the local angle. But in Akron, in Cleveland, but most certainly in the national news, the whole story also includes not just victims, it includes villains and vindicators, and those folks have to have the same personal coverage. That's where I feel the balance is off.
The further away from local you get, the bigger your obligation.
Absolutely, Al. That is. I think I said that.
You
but
did.
You said it.
No, you absolutely.
But that's absolutely my belief.
I like.
Absolutely.
But I like the way you differentiate between local news is one thing. It happens here, but when you get removed from it, the burden for using the image gets bigger, not smaller.
It gets bigger, and then the burden of saying, but wait, there's more than just the victim story. Mm-hmm. There is also the story that, by the way, whether it's Purdue or whether it's Sackler or whoever, there's a real personal story to the villains, and I know you don't want to. I don't expect journalists to frame it that way, but I would. I'm not wearing that collar, as you said. And then there's also the vindicators telling the stories of first responders and of therapists. That needs to be told too, and at the national level.
I want to ask you one other question, and then we got to close. Is there a difference in the way we treat this image, these two images, on different platforms? In other words, does Bruce have in print a different response than he might online, or that a blogger might have, or something like that? And then television, is there a difference?
I believe so. I think that's a really powerful question that you've asked, and I believe so. Charting that difference is difficult to know, but I believe there is, because
Let's stick it in the lap of the ethicist here.
Yes.
Go ahead, and you're going to be the last talk here.
Oh my. It's an interesting question, so I'm going to dodge it. And I will say that there is definitely a different responsibility for lack of a better term, professional media than someone posting to Facebook or social media. We hold ourselves to a greater code of conduct in part as a way to legitimize what we do. So certainly there, yes. And then I'm going to try not to dodge this question, but I don't have a good answer, so I'm just thinking out loud here. Is there an ethical difference in medium, is the question, right? So is there an ethical difference between print and online and television?
For example, online, I could give you the ability to toggle between showing the child and not showing the child.
Yeah.
But I can also give you I'm sorry. I can
no,
also give you
please save me.
I'll stall for time. I could also give you the ability to share.
No doubt.
Share, yeah.
And there's the ethical issue of, if you do use it online, do you remove it at any point from your archive so as not, because that's part of the continuing damage, right? And that's not usually in our code, that's not usually in our practice to say, you know what, we're only going to share this online for 24 hours. That's not what we do. And I think it's one of those conversations that we have to be thinking about is, how will this story affect the people most associated with it long term, not just short term? And how does the medium that we choose to publish in change, and how do we explain that? Here's what I hope you've pulled out of this conversation, and that is, ethical decision making isn't a yes or a no proposition.
Yeah,
it's a friction between harm and good. It's a friction between what we're trying to accomplish journalistically and all of those forces that would keep us from fully reporting, whether they're internal or external. And not to think of ourselves first, but also not to just focus on the harm first, because we're not going to tell much news. If all we do is say we're just not ever going to cause any harm to anybody, we certainly don't want to offend anybody. We can't do that either, right? So it's a little bit like, because we're at a conference where we're talking about things, it's a little bit like what surgeons do, right? Surgeons wouldn't say, I see you got a tumor, but I can't cut through that tissue to get to the tumor. No, they would say, look, I'm going to use a lot of skill. I'm only going to cause the intrusion. I'm only going to cause the cut that is necessary to remove the tumor, but I'm not going to use a chainsaw. I'm going to use, the least amount of invasion possible to get the tumor out, right? And I think that's what happens with journalism, is do we cause more harm than is justified by the good that we pursue? But when you pursue good as deep and large and as committed as the Inquirer did, I think you have the license, as expressed by many of our learned people, you have the license to go places you normally wouldn't have gone.
Absolutely.
Thanks for the discussion. Thank you, Sue.